Good morning from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm Ian Klaus, the founding director of Carnegie California, and we're here for a discussion this morning, and it's a very early morning for some of our discussants who are in Australia, and an evening in Africa and Europe, to discuss the intersection of urbanization and the built environment and the projection and establishment of state power. That sounds wonky, and indeed it is. But let me say that this originated over a coffee on a Saturday morning when I was reading the Financial Times Weekend and caught eye of a fascinating new book by Nick and Dorina, who are joining us on New Capitals. And it was glossy, it was attractive, it was the sort of thing that felt very far removed from the policy space. And I thought, we have to have this discussion. And they were kind enough to join us alongside two great Carnegie scholars. Let me say very quickly, we're grateful to all of you who are joining us. The question of the intersection, again, of urbanization, cities, and the built environment and state power, whether it be imperial or the modern nation state, is a difficult one to grasp. Most of us sit in our respective disciplinary environments or mediums and don't try to leap either from the local, the urban, to the global, the geopolitical, or spaces of foreign policy. And that's exactly what we're trying to do today. I feel very fortunate that I don't have to make the case that that is something that we should be discussing and analyzing and advancing policy around it. There is a long history to that, from the Roman to the British Empire. There's a remarkable decolonial moment where cities in the global south are built up or adapted or redesigned in the spirit of asserting a new vision for the future. And so you can look towards that history to understand how we got here today, but you can also look at lots of cities around the world that we're going to discuss, which showcase just how multiple nation states are trying to use urban areas to establish a brand, to establish a politics, to advance equity, or in some cases not. So thanks for joining us. And we have with us Nick Hans, who's a photographer. He's actually joining us from Belgium. His photography reflects on major contemporary themes such as migration, globalization, urbanization, and crisis. He's published 5 books that are listed on his CV with great geographic breadth and historical breadth, I know, from the post-Soviet era Russia to the Mediterranean, to his own house during globalization, to Dubai, and of course here to multiple locations around the world, from Brazil to Indonesia. One book in particular, Garden of Delight, was awarded the Magnum Photography Award in 2017. You can see his work in places like El País, Paris Match, Vanity Fair, and he's exhibited around the world. We're very fortunate to have him joining us, and we're going to get to look at some of his images. Dorina Pojani is Associate Professor in Urban Planning at the University of Queensland, Australia. Good morning. She teaches planning theory and history. Her research is international and comparative and covers a variety of built environment topics. One of her great recent books is Trophy Cities, A Feminist Perspective on New Capitals, and in addition to the new capital work she's done with Nick. And then in conversation with them will be 2 Carnegie scholars, Micah Weinberg, who's joining us from California, who's done important and innovative work on equity in California spaces, but also around some issues with which many of our international audience might not be tracking, the attempt to develop new cities or greenfield cities in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Nanjira Sambuli, who's joining us from Kenya, who has great insights into some of the new urban efforts that are happening in sub-Saharan Africa, but in particular around Nairobi. And so we're very, very lucky to have her with us. With that, I'm just going to kick it off to you, Dorina, to try to sort of give us some context, intellectual background to the conversation we're having, but also how these two things come together, the projection of power by a state through the development of new urban spaces. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for having me. Like you said, I researched and wrote a book called Trophy Cities a few years ago. It was about new capitals built from scratch since the beginning of the 20th century up until the present. I covered 7 case studies spread around the world and spread across time. And I wish I could say they were beautiful places to visit, but unfortunately, I cannot make that claim. In fact, I think that the case studies that I covered are mostly great planning disasters, in the sense that they've cost a lot of money to be built, but they do not work very well for their inhabitants. And they work worse for women than they do for the population at large. And my analysis, my critique is a feminist one. And I consider these cities as a reflection, materialization in space of the patriarchy that's embodied in the respective nations. So all these nations have created new capitals. I mean, there have been different reasons why they've done it. Some of them have wanted to build a new national identity, post-independence. Others, they wanted to show their economic capability or showcase their innovation, and so on. But the reality is that all these nations, I see them as patriarchies. So they're designed the way the patriarchal family is designed. So there is a father at the top, the pyramid, the father, the mother, then the children underneath. So that's how the nation is envisioned, with often a male figure at the top that's usually been the proponent of new capital cities. Typically, these have been the pet project of some powerful politician. And then the rest of the population is underneath and not involved very much in the design. In some cases, the new capitals have been created with the intention of being sort of socialist, egalitarian kind of cities, but pretty much all have failed in that respect. In fact, they've recreated the same social hierarchies that were evident in the old capitals. In no case was a nation able to leave those segregations and class divisions and hierarchies behind.
Thanks, Dorina. That's a wonderful way to kick us off. And I think actually the note on the continuing social hierarchies is a crucial one, and one that we'll get into later with regards to the sort of ways in which things are manifested, as opposed to being able to be revolutionary when they're built, and the systems in which a city is embedded, whether it be energy systems or economic systems. Nick, Dorina mentioned 20th century projects. You're now you have both recently done a big book on current new capital projects, but also capturing some that came from earlier in the 20th century. I think it'd be great to give some texture to Dorina's historical background and the theory behind this. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dorina. Thank you, Ian, for inviting me for this online conference. I'm going to share my screen because I'm a photographer. I want to show some photographs to you. Just a second. So if all goes well, you should see the cover of my book now. Yeah. New capital, building cities from scratch. The title is crystal clear. The 6 capital cities that I photographed in the past 3 years do not grow organically over the centuries, but were built from scratch in a relatively short period of time, according to a pre-designed master plan. They were not built to meet the needs and wants of the population, but rather to perpetuate political power. On the cover is a photograph that I took in the new administrative capital of Egypt. And in this brief presentation, I will show you photographs from each city, and I will point out some of the main features that struck me in each of these cities. Let's start with the oldest example, and probably the most well-known new capital that I included in this project, Brasilia, famous for its still wonderful architecture of Oscar Niemeyer. This is the National Congress, located on the monumental axis, which is a huge grassy plain that cuts the city into 2 symmetrical parts. Built in just 40 months of time, Brasilia was meant to be an egalitarian model city, as Dorina also mentioned before, and a symbol of a modern nation. But the utopian idea ultimately led to a segregated society, with an affluent center for the happy few and impersonal suburbs for the masses. And traces of social segregation can be seen in all of these new cities, particularly in Abuja, the new capital of Nigeria since 1991. To relieve the overcrowded former capital Lagos, a new capital was built in the center of the country. Abuja was to become a leading and a neutral city, strengthening unity within the ethnically divided country. This picture shows a tricycle taxi stand with a gated estate in the background. There is a real security problem in Nigeria. Jihadists like Boko Haram, but also ordinary criminals have developed a thriving business model based on kidnapping and extortion. So those who can afford it therefore live in one of the many luxurious estates, private residential compounds surrounded by walls, razor wire, and checkpoints. They are safe havens, sealed off from the chaos and the poverty of the outside world. And those with less luck and less financial means live in slums scattered throughout the city and in the suburbs. This is an entrance gate to one of the estates. It's a kind of, the architecture of fear, as some call it. Near Abuja Airport, a new and prestigious city within a city is being built. Its name is Centenary City, and it's, you can consider it as a smaller version of Dubai. It will have one of Africa's highest skyscrapers, luxury villas, five-star hotel, golf course, shopping malls, amusement parks, and even an urban safari park. The whole zone is a tax-free free zone and will completely be walled in. So only people who live and work there will be able to enter. Our next stop is Astana, since 1997, the capital of Kazakhstan, another country rich in gas and oil. As in Brazil and Nigeria, the capital moved from the periphery of the country to the center. This is a strategic choice to emphasize the country's unity. Astana is a real playground for architects and property developers, also very reminiscent to Dubai. Again, we see an urban development based on prestige, on nationalist symbolism, and on star architecture. The city has become an urban spectacle, a symbol of state power, and a means for image economy and national branding. The new capital was to become the spearhead of post-Soviet nation building, and its recent history is inextricably linked to this person, this previous president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was in power for 30 years in Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev's personality cult is extreme. His photo, this photo has been taken in the museum of the first president of the Republic of Kazakhstan. This is the official name of the museum, but this picture can be found everywhere in the city. This is the gilded handprint of Nazarbayev on display in an observation tower in the city. So visitors queue up to press their palm against the presidential hand while making a wish and a selfie. So this comes really close to religious adoration. Another characteristic of the new capitals is the urban sprawl. Since there was plenty of room, city planners didn't have to hold back. But the urban sprawl, of course, has major consequences for mobility, for transport. These cities lack a human scale and are very car-based. So there's little walking in most of these cities, and because the distances are so huge. The fourth city I'm showing is Sejong, South Korea's de facto administrative capital. It hosts the government center and all the ministries. It's supposed to help spread business opportunities and to relieve the overcrowding of Seoul. This is a picture of the morning rush hour, showing officials and government employees on their way to the government's center. Sejong has a circular design with a park and an artificial lake in the middle and high-rise buildings all around. All these buildings are new. Also these traditional style Korean houses in the foreground. Before 2007, this was agricultural land. Sejong is a smart city. in which traffic flows, air quality, and safety is constantly being monitored with CCTV cameras and sensors. This is the control room. Sejong is a bit less monumental, less car-based than the other cities, maybe a bit more on a human scale. Very tidy, very safe, very efficient, but at the same time, incredibly boring. It's a generic city. It's a city without historical stratification, without original inhabitants, without a character of its own. It could be anywhere, basically. Yeah, this cafe in a shopping mall was probably the saddest view from this trip. Next is the new administrative capital of Egypt, in short, NAC. The city doesn't have a name, a new name yet. So it's a prestige project of President El-Sisi, seen here on a billboard by a billboard of a real estate developer. El-Sisi is a former army general, and the Egyptian army has a lot of economic power. The land on which the NAC is being built is owned by the military. The main contractors are construction companies owned by the military. The army will be in charge of security and law enforcement of the new capital. So one could say that the NAC is a military project. This is a residential neighborhood under construction. People who want to live or work in the NAC are screened for their loyalty to the regime. And to purchase property, permission from the authorities is required. And this is just a way to keep out political opponents. NAC will also be a smart city, constantly monitored with cameras and sensors and cell phone trackers and even drones. So everybody will be closely being watched, and that is what El-Sisi is all about, building a prestigious power base where protests, as we have seen on Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, will be impossible. In a police state such as Egypt, the smart city is a tool for social and political control. This is the central business district under construction, with what is to become the tallest tower of Africa in the background at almost 400 meters high. And meanwhile, the residents of overcrowded old Cairo are left to their own devices. The contrasts cannot be greater. And the last city I will take you to is not a city yet. In 2019, the Indonesian president Joko Widodo announced the plan to build a new capital on Borneo, right on the edge of the oldest, one of the oldest and one of the most precious rainforests on Earth. The new city is called Nusantara, and this blue stone marks the geographic center of the new city, where 2 million people will live within 20 years. The area is currently being cleared. Major infrastructure works are in progress. The construction of the government center and the presidential palace is almost finished. About last month it was, on August 17, the capital was officially inaugurated. But the area is not uninhabited. There are people living in here for ages. 200,000 people scattered around 70 villages are losing all their prospects for the future. Their traditional way of life is incompatible with the new city, and they will have to move or adapt. So with a growing world population, new cities will have to be built and existing ones expanded. The big question here is, how do we build sustainable, livable, and socially inclusive cities? Except maybe for Sejong, the new capitals that I photographed are not the good examples. They encourage social segregation and put a burden on our environment. I think the neoliberal model of urban design, in which profit-making seems to be the main goal, is not compatible with economic equality, social justice, and ecological sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for sharing those pictures. Foreign policy is mostly conducted in words, sometimes spoken, mostly written. And famously, within the U.S. government, some other agencies will come with lots of slide decks, and State Department officials come with memos. And so it's wonderful to force us to expand how we communicate. I hope there's some time near the end to talk about how you framed those and the roles of the individuals therein, and how you think of yourself as a historical actor too. But first, I'd just like to respond to Dorina and Nick really quickly with a set of questions. And you mentioned the urban future, Nick, and thank you for doing that. We know that the world will be 70% urban by 2050. Most of that growth is happening in Asia and Africa. We know that the total cover of the earth by urban space will expand more in the next 2 decades than it has in human history. So the questions that are captured here are particular, of course, to the nation states and most relevant to the urban residents of these spaces. But they are also to all of us in a way, as we're part of a planetary urbanism as it comes to climate in particular, but a host of other challenges. And I wonder if you both could just quickly reflect on this question of intentionality. And that sounds wonky or philosophical. And foreign policy experts are very familiar with unintended consequences, but we don't often think about intentionality. Your last note on neoliberalism brings to mind Anthony Fontenot's work, who I think does awesome stuff on the sort of obsession with planners in the second half of the 20th century around non-planning, of someone not being totally in control, because when you had an individual in control, that allowed them to project their own visions, their own often patriarchal value sets. The downside, of course, was it left much to the market, and some of the risks that come from not having a master plan are a problem too. So when you look at these projects, Dorina, or others historically, or these ones in particular, Nick, how do you make sense of the upsides? The downsides are clear, but some of the sort of upsides that come from intentionally trying to create a new space, and there might not be any, but I think that action of doing it from above as opposed to organically from below, it leads to different results, as we know, and it is worth just sort of drilling down on a bit.
Well, since I produced Trophy Cities, I've done some work looking even farther back in history. At that period, during the Second Industrial Revolution, meaning mid-19th century up until World War II, because that era was particularly fertile in terms of the urban imagination. There were so many problems in existing cities due to industrialization, and so many thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic were trying to figure out what the solution was going to be, what the city of the future was going to be. And there were mostly male thinkers doing work in that era, but there were also some women, elite women, educated women. They were engaged in urban planning, at least at the edges. And one big difference we see from that literature is that men were often envisioning these fully formed utopias, trying to control the urban form, designing every street, the heights of the buildings. I mean, some of these men have produced full manuals how the new city was going to look like. Whereas the women that were involved in planning issues, for the most part, they were, I'm not saying they were infallible or perfect. Those ladies were, nobody's perfect, but they seemed to be more acute observers of the daily life of human beings. So instead of going for the monumental, instead of thinking in terms of large transport spaces, speed, the future, futurism, tall architecture, skyscrapers, etc., they were doing things like community-based work, looking after migrants, new migrants to cities, looking after the tenements for the poor, so arranging, helping them manage their rent payments on time. So things like that, much more smaller scale, but ultimately much more helpful. So to connect that story to the story of new capital cities, I've been asked in the past, well, what should new capitals look like? Because there might be, new nations. We still see large federations splitting up, and then when that happens, each bit of that federation needs its own capital, so they need to be thought through and designed. And so when people ask me that question, what should the capital of the future look like, how should we design it, my first reaction is, do not do a new capital. try to improve existing cities. And that kind of approach is in line with new ideas around degrowth, which in turn are based on older ideas of ecofeminism. So instead of going for always for new development, bigger, new cities, etc., let's try to improve the lot of the existing cities. Why not?
I don't know what to add to that. I completely agree with you, Dorina. Well, some of the examples that I showed, I don't think the intentions were good from the start. Like when you look at Egypt, I think that's the worst example. This is a completely military project. Other cities, big cities like Lagos, Jakarta, they have, of course, their problems, typical problems for mega cities in terms of pollution and traffic jams and lack of infrastructure. But yeah, just as Dorina says, why not trying to make those cities more livable instead of just building exclusive cities from scratch, cities that are only tailored to the rich. Nobody thinks about social housing in those cities. The people who are building those cities will never be able to live there. The only light that I saw during all those trips was maybe Sejong, although I said it's a bit boring, but maybe I'm a bit impatient as well. It needs generations for a city to mature. So let's wait and see. Brasilia now has, I think, its second generation of people who are actually born in Brasilia. So you can feel that the city is starting to get more organic. But at the same time, the initial layout of Brasilia is fixed. I mean, you cannot just remake it. It has been laid out as it was in the 60s. And still, in the 60s, I mean, that's a different time frame, but apparently still the new cities built today are making the same mistakes, although we know much more now about climate change and mobility and so on. So yeah, I think it's a missed chance. Yeah.
There's an urban think tank out of Cairo called Cluster that I admire greatly, and they did work a lot of work tracking movement around the city, but also organic bottom-up urban development around the Arab Spring. And they document a fantastic case where a highway which didn't have access to residencies nearby because of the unique land ownership rules in the Cairo, where in the absence of the state, the residents built a major infrastructure to enable them to access the bus and then even to build off-ramps. And this is not to say that communities should always be in charge of large infrastructure projects, but I love it as a sort of a gesture towards a particular country that has a tradition for top-down approaches, as captured in the new administrative capital. But here was a community, even just a series of buildings that got together and did sort of infrastructure from the bottom up in the absence of the state. So I think that the examples that we can pull from and how it can be done better are manifest. Nanjira, Micah, thank you guys for being here. Nanjira was along with our technology program as a non-resident scholar with it, I believe, now, and she. So she can speak to all issues of AI and in Africa in particular, but also as it sort of exhibits itself in the more local space, including in cities. And Nanjira, in addition to being an expert on the technology issues, I know you to be a very creative and deep and unique thinker. And Micah has experience in a California project that I think isn't often brought into these global conversations. And so I'm eager to do that. So Nanjira, please, you can tell us a little about what you're seeing on the new city efforts around Nairobi, or just respond and enter in the conversation. And then Micah, you can just jump right in.
Thanks, Ian. And I hope you can hear me okay. Much resonance to what has already been spoken about. And I think if I situate my sort of reflections on what we're seeing in Kenya, it's fascinating to realize that the idea of new cities has a mix of everything you could imagine. We've heard about smart cities, special economic zones, industrial science parks, airport city, railway city. So there's everywhere around, like every geographical point of Nairobi, there's something imagined around those dimensions, greenfield and brownfield. But I think the one that has been mostly known internationally is this idea of building the Silicon Savannah, and this being to the south of the city, Konza. It's supposed to be a flagship project under the Kenya's Vision 2030, which was this urban national master plan to ensure Kenya is a middle-income country by 2030 with all these great projects around it. So to the south of the city, we have the smart city imaginary, and to the north of the city would be this industrial special economic zone called Tatu City. And these two are supposed to be flagship projects realized by 2030. One of the most interesting things is obviously that we're not going to see them realized by 2030. There is some development happening, but that dream keeps being deferred, in part because of some of the things that Dorina was speaking about. When you announce the cities, you bring up old politics in new spaces. And one big one in Kenya, and especially around Nairobi, has been land. So you have, how do you settle dynamics around who owned the land around which these new cities are supposed to be developed? How's that settled? For Konza specifically, it touches on an area that has historically had a sort of pastoralist activity. And these are people who have not already been sort of fully immersed in the sort of modern economies that we have today. So land issues there have been particularly fraught. And then there's, of course, land speculation that attracts people who then buy the land on the cheap and then, try and sell the land to the developers, and creates a lot of dimensions. So both sides have that aspect going on right now. There's the involvement of the public-private partnership model, that at least in Kenya right now, those are 3 Ps that Kenyans have heard a lot lately because of what they bring up about what it means in practice. And, what does it mean when, preferential rights are given to, say, investors and foreign investors in this case, and not necessarily the locals. One thing that has been particularly interesting to see, even in the iterations of these 2 cities, for example, is that it hasn't yet shown where the place of the Nairobian or the Kenyan is. But there's a lot of who should be brought in. So, you have parts of the smart city that have a medical city that will be built by Chinese actors, the data centers that will be built in collaboration with different actors. But where the Nairobian or the Kenyan fits in is something we still don't know, except through land speculation for those who've been able to do that. And so that's been particularly interesting to see. Konza was supposed to have been a place that was supposed to bring up the hubs. Hubs had already organically happened within the city. There was one particular stretch of a city that folks just congregated around. I think the internet got there first. And so it was initially the idea of, we'll create a space for these people. But as we've seen with other smart cities everywhere that have been completed, and I think Bangladesh is a very good example, you can build a place but not necessarily be a livable place for the people you imagine are going to work and live there for different reasons: the vibe, the culture, all those things that really make a city beyond the infrastructural. And what's been curious is that we can't tell through literature or what's readily presented about Konza or Tatu City how they're adapting to these realities or best practices or bad practices from both the globe and its own iterations and what has made it stall. So I think there's a really interesting dimension here about whether these become urban fantasies and whose urban fantasies they are. And in the case of Nairobi, the fact that these two are tethered around Nairobi, which in itself is a city that happened by accident, by the way. It has a very interesting background, as it were. It wasn't meant to be a city, but then became one, and hasn't really had a coherent urban planning that has been continuous. So you see that those are the dimensions that then inform what happens when you take up new spaces that you want to sort of design. Now, the idea of the where tech comes in, it also continues to iterate, but there's still this idea or this fixation that you'll have this high tech that makes everything work. It's almost like the Wakanda imaginary, if you want to call it that. And we see that that still informs a lot of the cities that are being discussed. Even in Nigeria, we have Etana, just off of Lagos, that's supposed to be a sort of free zone for digital economy stuff. And so, where that interacts with people and the kinds of livable spaces people want remain conversations that haven't yet been heard. And would hope that, even as investors are drawn into these conversations, we can have them socialized to this idea of it takes more than just infrastructure to make a city. And it really is contingent on how much the people who would also be, surrounding that space are involved or incorporated into these ideas. I think lastly, I'll say that it also ties to some interesting ideas of what Nairobi is and should be. One term I've heard used by the foreign policy officials here is that Nairobi is a multilateral capital of the global south because it hosts, 2 UN headquarters. And so there's a lot of projection around Nairobi being the city of expatriates, but where do the locals fit in? A lot of development, a lot of all the ideals you want to see in a city happen in places that have expatriates more than they do those where there are locals. And these dimensions are playing out to where these new cities should be, including private cities that are being built also around Nairobi. So there are some really interesting dimensions that are emerging both in the tech, spatial, urban, and even rural and future of urbanization dimensions here. So every day is a new fun challenge.
Just to reflect really quickly as we jump to Micah, I hadn't thought about it, and I'm definitely not a master planner. But I am actually struck by the parallel and comparisons that can be done between the effort to create a new capital and the politics of that, and the effort to create technology cities, like say June, and the politics involved with that. Of course, some politics are integrated in the projection of power. We see this in, say, Chinese influence in the BRI around the world, but we also know that sometimes technology cities benefit from being at a great distance from a capital. For example, the San Francisco Bay Area is a place that has a unique spirit to it because of its 3,000 miles distance from Washington, D.C., among many other reasons. Micah, we're operating, you and I, in the San Francisco Bay Area that is very far from our national capital, that has its own unique spirit, but also is thinking about some of these things that people are in other geographies. So tell us a little bit about what's going on out here to put in a global context.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project initially called California Forever. And full disclosure, I have been a consultant to this project, as well as a fellow at Carnegie, though I'm no longer doing that. Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's really interesting. So this is not a political capital, but it's a plan to build an entirely new city from the ground up in what could be considered really an economic capital, or certainly an economic hub of the global economy, probably the hub of the global innovation economy. And at this point, it is very much an urban fantasy. It does not exist. There are 50,000 acres that have been purchased in Solano County, which is about 50 miles northeast of San Francisco. And the vision is to build a real city. So, when I look at the sort of gated communities, it really makes my heart hurt. In terms of the extent to which these cities are explicitly designed to not be inclusive and really end up being more sort of gated neighborhoods for the affluent than they are anything that really should even be able to be called a city. Now, of course, this is all a dream in California, but the plans for California Forever, which could be a city of as many as 400,000 people, are for a real place, a place with affordable housing, workforce housing, a healthy transportation system, and sort of all the things that come with a city that is going to cater to a variety of different people of different income levels and backgrounds, and not just be a gated community for the very rich. As is appropriate, perhaps, for this global economic capital, this is a project driven by a tech entrepreneur. So this is not something that was organized by the government or by a political leader, but really by the kind of person who it actually, in his case, has, but the kind of person that creates a new tech company. And so this entrepreneur, working with some really major investors based in Silicon Valley, managed to sort of secretly buy up these 50,000 acres and avoid the sort of land speculation, just has this vision for a city in California. Now, why build a new city in the Bay Area? Well, we have really a dire housing shortage in the Bay Area for a variety of different reasons. It's incredibly difficult to build things here. So arguably, Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area has had one of the most successful economic runs that any place has ever seen, stretching back to the beginning of the 1970s. And every new wave of technological advancement, from the personal computer to AI, continues to happen here. Yet, with very few exceptions, the San Francisco Bay Area looks very much like it did in the 1970s, and it's incredibly hard to build things here. And a lot of the development that has happened here has been low amenity urban sprawl far from the city centers. And so the idea of having a new city that has a city center, that has infrastructure supportive and amenities supportive of living is really interesting, but also incredibly difficult given the tremendous complexity and regulations and jurisdictional competition that occurs out here. And I'm actually pretty excited about it. You know, I was in a conference about new cities the other day, and you know, people talked about, wow, you guys have so much technology out there in the Bay Area. This will clearly be, you know, you have such smart cities. And I just had to laugh. For any of you who have visited the Bay Area, you know that we invent a lot of technology here. We don't use any of it. So the idea of creating a new sort of, you know, smart city from the ground up that it could incorporate some of these technologies is really fascinating. So I just want to hit some of the challenges and then looking forward to wrapping up the conversation. But, you know, in some ways, obviously, you know, Nick and Dorina, there are lots of concerns about the ability of dictators and others to go out and build infrastructure. Honestly, from the perspective of the Bay Area, I'm a little jealous about the ability to build infrastructure. You know, we have tremendous difficulties expanding our transit system and, you know, building any new roads and so on. And so for most places, you just build the infrastructure that a city needs. In California, we say there's no infrastructure, you can't have a city there. So that's a bit of a challenge. There's obviously an incredibly complex bureaucracy to navigate to get something like this done when you don't have a patriarchal dictator dictating it. But then there's also been a lot of local opposition. And it's interesting because, you know, even the language of colonialism gets used sometimes, in spite of the fact that it's largely the same commute shed and 50 miles from where, you know, sort of the center of San Francisco. But there's still this desire to really have local people determining the future and the shape of where it is that they live, even if those local people are just 50 miles away from the folks that are starting up a new project. So that's been interesting. But it looks as if, fingers crossed, and who knows when and whether all this happens, there has been a rapprochement between the sort of tech entrepreneur building a new city in this global tech capital and the local folks. There was an initiative that was going to permit this to happen that got pulled off the ballot to allow for future collaboration. And we'll be tracking this very closely. But I'll just conclude by saying that I sort of initially was like, why am I presenting on this, you know, within the context of like new capitals, but then really realized that in a lot of ways, this is a new capital. But then it, you know, is built in a way that, or hopefully will be built in a way that provides a real contrast with some of the, you know, sort of cautionary tales that you document for us, Nick and Dorina and Nanjira.
It's now become apparent to me that if we asked Dorina to list off new technology cities or urban areas, she probably could fill up the rest of our remaining time. Having opened the technology city question, and we will return to that. And I think there's actually a question from the audience that I'd like to surface, but first, really quickly, thinking of a capital city does a particular exercise that a technology city does not, in that it is both about the politics of the domestic nation state, but also it is a statement internationally. And then, Jerry, you mentioned the sort of Nairobi as a multilateral capital, expat capital, Geneva as the Nairobi of Europe, or vice versa, however you want to sort of put it. And Nick, the real serious climate and sustainability challenges that we all face and that we face particularly around the future of urbanization. And I mention that because one of the things that I have noted is that cities, new cities often like to brand themselves in accordance with something, with the SDGs, with Paris goals. And I wonder what you saw when you were doing this project, Dorina and Nick, in terms of that, the sort of idea of trying to root yourself in what's actually happening in the development of the city, but then simultaneously a branding effort that goes well beyond the construction that's happening there and is trying to say something to the rest of the world.
I think the funniest example to me is in South Korea, and it applies to Sejong, but also other new cities that have been recently built there. They've invented this concept of eco-U city, as in eco as in ecological, and then U means ubiquitous city, which is sort of a South Korean term for smart city. So ubiquitous as in Internet of Things, integrated with cars and buildings and roads and all kinds of infrastructure, waste management, etc. So they have attempted to kind of roll all these fancy terms that float around, ecology, smart city, etc. in this one concept, eco-U city. But to me, that's more branding than anything else. And a lot of the techno-utopias that we see proposed around the world now are little more, to me, they're little more than PR exercises. Sometimes they're literally meant to sort of restore the reputations of particular leaders in particular places. Their reputation might have taken a hit because of something that they've done that's been in the news. So then they try to put a band-aid on that via a new smart city, and that's a pretty expensive PR exercise, I would say.
Dorina, it strikes me that, we, with the African context, we also have the celebrity fixation of cities. So we've had in Senegal, Akon trying to build a smart city, he said fashioned after Wakanda, and now Idris Elba talking about a smart eco-city in his home country of Sierra Leone. And it's a fascinating imaginary that we've seen a lot of African actors asking, this is what we asked for, and it's a fascinating question, but we see that it ends up being nothing more than a PR exercise, which is quite tragic because of a lot, the opportunity cost.
Yes, well, tragic and also as patriarchal as all the examples that we've seen before. It's often some kind of male backer. In the past, we had this powerful politician. We still have those for sure. But now we also have these very wealthy tech entrepreneurs. And it's true. I mean, Micah said how in California it's hard to get things done. But then it's also a big concern when things feel like they're inevitable because the backers are so rich and powerful, and something absurd that is proposed is likely to be built, and you as an individual have so little power to do anything about it.
We have a great set of questions. Nick, if you want to jump in there, but we have a great set of questions here that actually were opened up by a couple of points that I think we obviously didn't have time to, in each of your respective interventions, dig into it. And they really surround governance. And so there's a question from the audience: what, if any, are the potential governance challenges that might arise from the construction of new sites? What about public transportation in new sites? And one of the things that I'm struck by, and tax laws were mentioned, as were land ownership laws, is that one of the things that often happens in some of the new urban spaces, to include capital cities, but not exclusive to them, actually probably more frequently outside of them, is an experiment in governance. And this is what special economic zones once were before they become some standard. This is what Dubai and other cities in the Gulf have done, where you even block by block have a quilt of governance approaches, where you can do some things in certain quarters, but not other things in others, which is a historical point too, obviously. But I wonder if you guys have any reflection on the governance practices that emerge that allow for experimentation, which is a good thing, and policy exchange across borders, which is also a good thing, mostly, as it comes to these new urban spaces. And obviously, you're seeing an experiment in Nairobi and in Konza and in Techno that had two different approaches to governance.
I mean, I can speak to the ones coming up to Nairobi, and an immediate challenge will be whether they are tethered sort of politically to how Nairobi itself is governed. We have a federal system of governance too, and it does touch across another border point with another county in Kenya, and actually 3 counties intersect where Konza is, for example. So which jurisdiction has governance authority over it is going to be an interesting political tussle where the city expands or could expand to becomes another one. But we see in the case of special economic zones or industrial parks that it almost sounds like the governance will be a private form that sort of confers with the public, but not necessarily involving the people. So the people coming in as a sort of transitional element, and especially when it comes to the local actors. And well, for now, that's a speculative aspect, but as this is being realized, we imagine that will happen. What I've seen that's particularly interesting is both ideas of walkable cities being imagined in the spaces. But in the case of Konza, for example, being in a more arid area, that means you'd have to think a lot about greenery. And this is the very thing that in Nairobi, which was once called the Green City in the Sun, has been taken down for a lot of infrastructure to create, expressways and other, built spaces that have taken away from the nature that would make it walkable. And where people currently in Nairobi, 7 million of us go through here every day, for example, who want walkable spaces but are not getting that. So how could it be that those very actors will create that in another space that is peripheral to the operational area that we're in? Is a real urgent question. And I find that there's this idea, and especially playing out in Africa right now, where we talk about a future governance as this future project that doesn't often incorporate the now. And it's almost like the long-termism aspect that we see in tech as well, that we'll have these ideas of the future. So let's think about this for our children, but not those of us who have been children for a long time and are adults now and also want these spaces. And we see that sort of playing out in how governance is discussed as this future tense issue and not a present continuous one.
And I see a question there around public transportation, future modes of public transportation in future cities, and that's right up my alley. So I will not be the one to advocate for flying taxis and such horrors. I feel like it's challenging enough to manage traffic on the ground as is. Imagine if we also have the sky covered with flying vehicles. What would that look like? But I'll say this, public transport, I'm a big supporter of public transport, so I'll say that up front. I'm car free myself. I don't use a car at all, so I rely on public transport almost entirely. But I must say that public transport, as we know it, is a patriarchal mode. Okay, so bringing feminism in again into the conversation. It was created in the early 20th century, late 19th century, to serve the commutes of working men. That's why a lot of public transport systems that we see to this day sort of connect suburbs to a city center, or maybe multiple city centers, because women were meant to be in the suburbs raising the kids, and the men were supposed to commute to work. And we continue with that legacy. I mean, we haven't been able to extricate our public transport systems from patriarchal legacy. So when we discuss the future, if we want our public transport systems to become feminist, then we need to think of them in much more flexible terms, much more demand responsive transport that can accommodate shorter trips potentially with kids and with space for shopping bags, and the kind of transport that caters to what we call the mobilities of care, as opposed to mobilities of work exclusively.
Dorina, Nick, please.
I just wanted to add, in some of the new cities that I visited, like Astana and also in Egypt, in the new administrative capital, they have built a light rail transit, like the one they have in Dubai. But I sometimes think this is just another prestige project. Of course, it's good to have it, but if it's only that, it doesn't solve the problem of traffic. When you take metro in Dubai and you get out of metro, you still need to take a taxi or a car to get to your destination. You really need a more fine network of public transportation. And also, if you allow if you provide a lot of highways and parking lots in the city, you just attract cars. You just have to try to ban the cars and get everybody on collective transport. I think that's the only solution for a livable big city.
Jane Jacobs asked, when did we hold the election that decided our cities would be built for cars? Dorina, I wonder, and Micah, you can jump in on this too, and then I think I'll ask you a final question, maybe Nick. Leslie Kern has, of course, done great work on the feminist city, and I wonder, looking at particular, actual specific examples, do you find that sort of the care city approach or the care neighborhoods that have emerged in, say, Bogota or Medellin, that are meant to sort of have a built environment that is more focused on sectors that are traditionally gendered more feminine, and that there are good developing practices around the non-patriarchal city, or is it, what excites you?
There are a few small-scale examples here and there, but unfortunately, a feminist society has never existed in history. So unless we transform society, we cannot be expecting to transform our cities. So my critique is much more radical, and I think urban design critiques only go skin deep. I mean, we need to look farther into the structures on which the patriarchal city is built and transform those first.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. The idea of cities as a projection of an underlying society. And I don't know. I mean, I'm a little hopeful in terms of what we're trying to do out here in California, but maybe it is a function of that, very collaborative. I mean, bureaucracy is really frustrating, or, sort of all these different governance tools are very frustrating, but it also means a lot more people get a say. And so it isn't just the vision of one individual. Now, the downside can be nothing happens, and you end up with the massive housing crisis like we have here in the Bay Area. But the upside can be that you do end up, designing cities in a way that is responsive to the needs of a broader set of people. And so the plans for transportation in California forever, involve a lot of self-driving buses and, sort of transportation that's sort of easier to adapt to people's needs than is like creating fixed rail, sort of light rail, or, major highways and, other things that are not going to be quite as adaptive. So we'll see. I mean, there is this tension, right? Because we do need to build some things. There are going to be more people in the world, and they need to live somewhere, and it can't all be ex-urban sprawl, right? That said, when, we have a projection of the, ego of a particular, state leader, we may end up with places that are not livable for anyone. But it's an interesting dynamic tension.
Thanks, Micah, and thanks, Dorina. The systems approach that you mentioned, Dorina, is entirely consistent. I think not with the same, is partly consistent with where the IPC is going to end up with the only special report that's going to come out with AR7, which is that everything has to be thinking it from a much more structural and systemic fashion. We only have 2.5 minutes, and I want to have a chance to thank you all. But Nick, a final question for you, and it's because it is not traditional that we have a photographer in discussion in Carnegie. And when I think about cities from the past, or even cities in the present that I understand, I know them better from novels and photographs than I do from pieces of sociology or reflections on urban planning. The Brasilia I know is René Moraes. Anything I know about walking on a roof on a building in Brazil, I learned from him, not from the history I've read. And so as you capture these places, and you have done that all over the world, how do you think about your role in policy on the one hand, advancing human knowledge on the other, and celebrating art and capturing beautiful things too?
Yeah, I think my role as a photographer, a documentary photographer, is it's kind of historical, how you call this, historiography, like documenting what happens, document the spirit of the times, document what's the tendencies of this time we are living in. I mean, we all like to see pictures or look at pictures from the past. It's important that we keep these visual witnesses, this visual this documentation. And the pictures that I make today from cities that are still emerging, are not finished yet, they might maybe be more valuable within some decades. I saw in Brasilia, I saw the very first picture of Brasilia, which was mainly a crossroads, two roads, dirt roads in the Cerrado, in the savannah, and this was the plano piloto, what ultimately became Brasilia. So maybe the pictures that I took in Nusantara, they will become more and more important. Me and all other photographers, of course, that are also making pictures of the world without staging, without putting things, and just trying to catch daily life as it is, as it unfolds. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, a hard and fast rule at Carnegie too is that we don't go overtime because we respect those who took the time to speak with us, but also to join us. And so, for you who are watching, pick up Trophy Cities, pick up Capital Cities, check out Nick's other work on his website and in publication. Nanjira has a fantastic paper from March on digital inclusion in Africa, and a more recent one on the connection between California and Africa, urban spaces. And Micah Sambuli is delving deep into questions about equity in California and how our democracy is advancing while also simultaneously taking steps back, a bit like a crab walk. So thank you all for joining us, Nick, Nanjira, Dorina, and Micah, and everybody online. And see you next time.